Mr. Russell.
What is happening right now?
Got a juvenile Yankee making his jokes there. Time for the theme song, I think.
That's Americanist, Dell. The magic man, we know that you can hear us. That's the point. What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another episode of Faith Unaltered, the Complete Sinner's Guide and Real Seekers. I am just one of the fabulous co-hosts we have with us tonight. My name is Tyler Fowler. With us, we have Dale Glover, David Russell, and Joshua Davidson. Guys, it's good to have you with us. Tonight, we are talking about the role of music within the church with our special guest, Clinton Wilcox. Sir, how are you doing tonight, Clinton? If you would go ahead and give, since this is your first time on the show, I noticed that you had some history, though, with David and Dale. And so this is kind of like a little reunion that y'all are having tonight. So I'm excited
Not
about
that he
that.
even remembers me, though. Jeez.
I
I feel like
I'm sorry.
I meet a lot of people in my work. I'm sorry.
Dale, you're the long lost cousin that just people forget about. Like, oh yeah, that guy is part of our family, but it's the Canadian thing, bro. So
Pretty much, yeah.
That's what happens when you're in another country, you know.
That's right.
Red cream soda, David. Let's let Clinton introduce themselves.
But go ahead, Clinton. Give us a little background about yourself and introduce yourself to our audience.
Sure. My name is Clinton Wilcox. I guess I'll give you relevant details for this discussion. I'm a classically trained clarinetist and pianist. I started taking piano lessons when I was 5 and started taking up the clarinet when I was 10 and basically stuck with both throughout my life. And I actually started getting involved in church music when I was just in 7th grade. I had sang a hymn, in front of my church during a Sunday morning, and the adult choir actually wanted to bring me in and have me start singing with them. So I started singing with them when I was, in 7th grade, stuck with it throughout high school, started playing in a worship band that our youth group had started, and started playing for them. And then once I actually graduated high school, I got the opportunity to start leading worship in the Baptist church that I had grown up in. And so that's just kind of a brief overview of my time in the Baptist church. Since then, I've been basically involved in worship bands throughout my life, or have actually led worship at various churches. After the Baptist church, I left the Baptist church because of some hostility there regarding what types of service we were going to use, because I was a contemporary worship leader and the traditional worship leader wanted to bring us back to just one service. That was kind of a big thing that I don't know if I should really go into, or I don't mind talking about it if that's something the group wants to talk about. But that was one of the reasons why I left. I actually lived through 2 church splits, but basically after the second one, I was like, I was just saying that I think it's probably time for me to move on, even though I've been in that church since I was just a small kid. So I
Sure.
went through another couple churches and finally settled in a Lutheran church, where I started playing in the worship band. But once the worship leader left, the pastor had asked me to step up and start actually leading the worship band. And that was actually my first experience with liturgical worship, because they were very liturgical there. So I would occasionally be called in to fill in for the more traditional service pianist. And so I would actually play the liturgy there, and got experience doing that. And then, eventually I moved out of California, where I lived for most of my life until I was, I'm 41 now. I lived there until I was about 40. And so I started, I moved to Las Cruces, New Mexico, and started doing worship for a church in El Paso. And that's where I've been for the past couple of years, until January of this year, when they decided to restructure their service and go in a different direction. So my services there were no longer needed. So I'm kind of between churches now. But, playing in worship bands as just a support, or actually doing worship leading, I've been involved in that basically my entire life. But I am also a classically trained musician, and have had, opportunities doing that. And I've also performed in various local bands, in the places that I've been. Right now, I currently play in 2 local rock bands. So, yeah, that's just kind of a sort of a brief history of my, time doing music in the church.
Right on. And Theory 7. So I know that you had said one of your rock bands do not have YouTube, but if y'all want to check out Clinton's one of Clinton's bands that he's in, Theory 7 is the YouTube channel.
Yeah, just be warned, they're not a Christian band. so don't expect sometimes they, I don't think there's anything really objectionable in any of the YouTube links we have up. But by all means, if you like rock music, definitely check us out. I definitely think the music is really good. But just keep in mind that it's not a Christian band, so.
Right on, right on. Well, we appreciate you joining us tonight, Clinton. If I could start off this conversation by asking, what was it that initially got you interested into music?
Well, just like being Christian, I was kind of born with a Bible in my hand. I was sort of just born into it. I don't, I come from a musical family, even though my family members haven't really pursued careers in music. They had some background in music. My mom played flute in high school. My dad played guitar. My mom played. Yeah, she played flute. My sister though played piano. She was actually really good at piano, but she didn't really stick with it into her adult life, but she was actually pretty proficient doing it classically. So I do have some experience with it in my family, but I also kind of have a natural affinity for music that I just kind of took to it naturally, and even now, like I could, I don't necessarily need to practice all the time in order to be able to play the music. I just kind of have a natural ability for it. I'm not a prodigy by any stretch of the imagination. I'd be a lot better if I if I practiced more. But I at least have a natural ability toward it, to where I can just pick up instruments pretty easily and that kind of thing. So considering I just kind of had a natural ability for it, also kind of meant that I had a natural inability to do sports, because I tried doing sports also. I played baseball, I played basketball, a couple other things, and I was just terrible. I am not an athlete. So that kind of solidified my my desire to want to stick with music, because I definitely couldn't do sports.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I think it's either one of the two, right? You're either really good at sports or really good at music. I tried both and found
Probably.
out that I was good at none, and so that's why I'm
Oh,
hosting a podcast. But no.
right.
So well, we definitely appreciate you. So the plan is tonight, gentlemen, that we are going to be going into some of the history of music within the church. We're going to discuss a little bit of the schism between the churches of Christ and other churches whenever it comes to whether or not musical instruments can be used. And I do want to get everybody's opinion on modern contemporary worship music today, from bands like like Lauren Daigle, for instance, Elevation, Hillsong, things of this nature. And so that's the overview for our audience tonight. But let's kick it off. Josh, we know that you are yourself a musician as well. And let me just ask you this, going into it. Um, where do you play drums for your church, right? And do you see an issue, like whenever we discuss music within the church and the confines of the church and how we worship? I didn't know this, but there are some people who see music as a salvation issue. If you are worshiping, and namely the churches of Christ, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but if you worship with music or instruments, excuse me, then you could possibly be in danger of hell at this point, because God takes worship extremely serious, and there's no precedent for music within the church. Or I keep saying music, I mean instruments, because they would view singing as music, a cappella, right? That is a form of music. And so let me just ask you, Josh, do you see this as a primary issue, a secondary issue? What do you think about this being even a salvation issue?
A salvation issue, I would disagree with. But as for first or secondary, I really think it's kind of an integrative issue, where it's not necessarily like it is primary or secondary. Music is a tool. It's not a doctrine. And so I think it would be odd to look at music and its inclusion in the church as something primary, secondary, but it is integrated in that there's never been a time, even in Christianity's inheritance from the Hebrews, that scripture wasn't chanted in a song, or psalms weren't, like, psalms themselves are actually lyrical. Like, music is integrative into the entire human experience, religious or not. Secular atheist bands still have the same kind of concerts where there's that guy up in the front, everybody's there, they all have this remarkable feeling of either belonging or something bigger than themselves that they're participating in, and so forth. It's very liturgical, and so it's not something that I think that we can honestly get away from. So we are going to confront the problem of music, but I think that thinking about it as something salvific, I think is pushing it to a corner of things that I think is going to make hostility where it doesn't need to be. Mm-hmm. But I can see, in terms of, let's say, just the plain logical bones of the thing, I can see why somebody would say music's one of those things that creates a slippery slope, creates a slippery slope, right?
Mhm.
And so as somebody who plays music, I have probably a different take on that than somebody who's sitting, in their bedroom. They don't play the instrument, they push play on the radio, and then
Right.
they listen, right?
Mhm.
That person has a different experience of music, personally, aesthetically, whatever, than a person who actually plays music, right?
Mhm.
Because I play drums, I look at syncopated rhythms not as the devil's beat, but as something that has mathematical placement.
Mhm.
It's not like this magic. It's not magic, right? To somebody who doesn't know about music, it feels about as close as you get to magic. And as somebody who was drawn by the enchanted nature of music when I was young, I didn't play any instruments. I heard it. I listened to bands like Earth, Wind, and Fire. I listened to Johnny Lang when I was little. I had cassette tapes of Johnny Lang. I had that's blues. I had Take Six as an a cappella band that does Christian music. I used to listen to Stevie Ray Vaughan, and I was just mystified. Like, this music. It's so consistent, but all of it's like vastly different. But there are things, it seemed like cut and paste things that kind of could make sense of all of them. It's like, what's going on here? I think what we're noticing is that, like I said, it's integrative. It's part of the human experience. If somebody thinks you're not allowed to have instruments while you're worshiping, I hope they don't clap. I hope they don't accidentally tap their foot. Like, literally anything can become percussive if you're a drummer. And
Mhm.
so that right there is a line that I don't even know where to draw. You know what I mean? And so I think that it's simply too amorphous. It's something that's like, it's like trying to pin a jellyfish to the wall. It doesn't work.
Yeah, so Warren asks, I love this dude. He comes up with some of the most random things sometimes. And so I want to get your guys' opinion on this. How long until acapella death metal contemporary services become a thing? I'm going to say, I'll jump this one off. I'm going to say within the next 10 years. That's my guess. But what do you guys think? Yeah?
Yeah. I think there's a
Yeah,
natural increase in BPM.
Yeah. Go ahead, Clinton.
Yeah, I have actually heard of I don't think they were death metal, but they were more like speed metal, and I have actually heard of a worship service in like Norway or something that actually had like a metal band doing as their worship, because that's just kind of the music that there's a big metal culture there in
Yeah.
Norway, or surrounding areas like Finland, or that like the Nordic countries or wherever. I forget specifically where it was, but I have heard of that kind of thing going on. And I know acapella death metal is kind of a funny concept, but there is actually an acapella metal group called Van Canto, which I don't know if anyone's heard of, but they actually do popular metal songs by Metallica, Iron Maiden, and they do it all acapella. They're very much a novelty band. I listened to them do a live recording, and it just did not hold up well doing it live. But if you could check that, like listen to one of their recordings on YouTube, and it's actually pretty interesting. But so that kind of thing, I have heard of at least one band that does the acapella metal thing.
I'm going to say so. So I'll go even one further, Warren. I will say it will begin within 10 years, and the source of this will be Sweden. It's either going to be Norway, Sweden, or Finland, because like Clinton said, there is a huge metal culture in those countries. Amongst other places, Germany has a big metal scene. And so we see, but I'm going to say Sweden, just because everything happens in Sweden, right? And so that's my guess. Anybody else want to jump in on that before we move? So no, I'm assuming. But anyway, so Dale and David are not metalheads by any stretch. But
oh no, the metal question, no way. I have no idea. I don't want any idea. Sorry, guys. I know.
Yeah, and actually,
you're no fun, Dale.
Yeah,
I grew up in the. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Clinton.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that I do enjoy I enjoy a wide variety of music. Being a musician, especially playing in bands, it kind of behooves me to know a wide variety of music. But there's actually so I do listen to some metal bands. I don't listen to anything too heavy, because I don't appreciate the music of where the singers just screaming or growling, that kind of thing. So there is actually a legitimate discussion to be had about when music ceases to be music. So I think bands with like where the singer like screams or growls the whole time, I think that those kinds of bands kind of cross the threshold into just being noise, not music. I know that fans of that genre would disagree, but there is a legitimate discussion to be had there too. about when music ceases to be music and just becomes noise. Yeah.
Maybe we could do a part 2 on that sometime in the future about when music ceases to be music, because I absolutely agree with you. The problem is that sometimes, well, especially in this conversation, right? Like, there is definitely a subjective element to what is even music at this point, right? And so what's music to, a lot of people might not be like just noise to me. But I think to incorporate music, you have to have a couple things, right? You have to have, well, I take that back. No, I'm just going to save that for the next show. But anyway, so let's jump into it, shall we? I want to look at this precedent for instrumentation within the church, especially because, so in prepping for this, y'all, I was listening to a debate between Bob Ross, no, not the painter, and a gentleman, he's Church of Christ pastor, minister, Tom Bright. Now, this is an old debate, okay? And so I tried to find some more recent things, and I'll get into that, but the Churches of Christ have split. And mainly, one of their big elements that we talk about, that we hear people talk about a lot, is this concept that they do not use instruments in their worship service. And what I said earlier about this being even a salvation issue, right? And so I want to set a precedent. Let's just jump into it, the history of instrumentation within the church. I think we have, and so I'll lay my case out just for a second, and then Clinton will get your response, and then anybody else that wants to jump in, we can. But I do see instrumentation in the Old Testament, right? Worship so I would agree with the Churches of Christ on one issue, primary issue, and that is that God does take worship extremely serious. We see this in the Old Testament. Nadab and Abihu, for example, were killed because of illegitimate liturgical services performed, right? Uzzah, who touched the Ark of the Covenant whenever God explicitly commanded him not to do so, ends up dead for trying to stabilize the Ark from falling in mud. Go ahead.
Yeah, he just touched it accidentally. So.
Right.
I was just saying,
right.
It was just accidental with him. He wasn't trying to do it. Yeah.
Right. Oh, okay. Fair enough. And so we see this concept of God does take worship serious. He does take his commands extremely serious. And we also see in the Old Testament this use of instrumentation. We see the Psalms are set to music specifically, right? We see in 1 Chronicles 15:16, David also commanded the chiefs of the Levites to appoint their brothers as singers who should play loudly on musical instruments, on harps, lyres, and cymbals, and raise sounds of joy. 1 Chronicles 16:42, Heman and Jeduthun had trumpets and cymbals for the music, and instruments for sacred song. The sons of Jeduthun were appointed at the gate. 1 Chronicles 23:5, 4,000 gatekeepers, 4,000 shall offer praises to the Lord with instruments that I have made for praise. And so we see this concept. The list keeps going on and on, ladies and gentlemen. But we see this concept of instrumentation used in the Old Testament covenant, right? In the Old Covenant. We see it. I mean, it's just clear. Now, here's where the Churches of Christ will go a different route. Once things happen in the New Covenant, everything changes. Once the New Covenant is institutionalized, because we do not have a direct command from God in the scriptures, which can be debated, by the way, that deals with instruments, that we only have the command for singing. That's the reason we should not play instruments, and it's a salvation issue. Do you guys agree with that? And I'm not misrepresenting their position. I will link to the debate between Ross and Bright, and you guys can hear it yourselves, right? I'll also link to another podcast. Hold on, let me pull up my notes real quick. I want to give the name of the podcast. It's the Authentic Christian Podcast with Aaron Scott and Tucker, and they are a couple. There's three of them, and they're all involved with the Church of Christ. I'll link to the video where they say specifically that this is a salvation issue, and who are we to determine what is a salvation issue and what is not whenever it comes to God's commands and God's worship. But I just want to get your guys' opinion on this. Is this first of all, is this a good argument that because instrumentation is not commanded in the New Testament, therefore it's a salvation issue, and if you participate in it, you are probably damned. What do you guys think? Clinton, we'll start with you.
No, I have a clarification question, Tyler. So I'm
Go
going to
ahead.
interrupt.
Okay.
I just want to know the Church of Christ. Obviously, I think from my understanding, these guys are a cult. This is the church of people like David Johnson and stuff like that. Do they? Because I noticed in one of the verses you read, you're like, there are instruments designed or made for praise and stuff like that. Do they have like a blanket? All instruments are sinful, or is it just particular instruments like drums or stuff like that?
All instruments, only a cappella is acceptable to God.
Okay. That was my clarifying question. So yeah, over to Clinton.
Yeah, good question. Go ahead, Clinton.
Yeah. Okay, well, clearly I do not agree with them because I am an instrumentalist myself. I do sing as well, but I'm primarily an instrumentalist. And so, yeah, I would say no, that's a terrible argument. I mean, the New Testament never says that we can drive around in cars. So why aren't we still, riding around on donkeys like they did in Jesus' time? So just because we're not specifically commanded to do so doesn't mean that we are I'm totally blanking on the word. Doesn't mean that we are prohibited from doing so just because we're not specifically commanded. In fact, the New Testament does tell us to sing, sing a new song to the Lord, that kind of thing. But the voice is an instrument. So when you're singing, you are using an instrument. It's a natural instrument, one that we're all born with. Some of us are born with better instruments than others, but we're born with a natural instrument to sing. You can use your voice as an instrument. You can use it to produce words when you sing, but you can also use it to hum or to whistle or, all sorts of different things that you can use your voice as an instrument for. So by telling us to sing, God is telling us to use instruments, specifically, he's specifically naming one, but, he is telling us to use instruments. Additionally, in fact, Josh mentioned this point earlier, is that, Christianity is an offshoot of Judaism, which means that not only did we inherit the Old Testament from the Jews, but that also means that Christians inherited the musical tradition of the Jews. And so we have very specific commandments in the Old Testament that we should be using instruments. We have Psalm 150, praise the Lord with the loud and clanging cymbal, praise the Lord with the lyre and the harp and the trumpet and those kinds of things. I like to tell people that if King David were alive today, he'd be a rock musician. I truly believe that, and that's met with various forms of affirmation or rejection. But so we have various commands in Scripture, like in the Psalms, to use different instruments in our worship. We have 1 Chronicles 25, which God specifically called out certain people to be musicians, but He also said that these musicians had to be skillful. Today, we'll allow just anyone who picks up a guitar, learns a few chords. We'll put them in front of a church and allow them to do the worship music. But in the Old Testament, they were commanded that they had to be skillful musicians, not just someone who played at an amateurish level, but they actually had to know their instrument. They had to be proficient at it. But so it seems like in the Old Testament they had much more stringent requirements for musicians than we do today. We tend to not hold church musicians today to such a high standard that God did it in the Old Testament. But even discounting Old Testament times, music throughout church music throughout throughout history, from the first century church through the medieval times, and then through the classical eras like Renaissance, Baroque, those kinds of things, musicians had to be skillful because of the music that was being composed by folks like Bach and Mozart and Vivaldi. They wrote complicated music that's wonderful and has withstood the test of time, but music that not just anyone could play, music that you actually had to be proficient on your instrument to do. So, I completely disagree with this idea that we can't use instruments in the church. In fact, a lot of wonderful music has been composed. One of the most famous works of all, The Messiah by George Frederick Handel, was composed as like a 2 or 2.5 hour composition about Jesus, about his prophecies and his being born and his ministry, those kinds of things. A lot of wonderful music has been composed for the church, and I just don't see any sort of reason to discount the use of instruments just because there may not be any specific commandments about using instruments in the New Testament that we're told primarily to sing. But I think that just shows that instruments are permitted because your voice is an instrument. If instruments weren't permitted, I don't see why we'd be able to use our voices for that kind of thing either. So that'd be my basic response to that.
I think that's a good way to look at it, Clinton. But guys, what do you think? Josh, David, Dale, is this a good argument that because the New Testament doesn't explicitly state we should use instruments in the church, therefore we should not use them, and it is a salvation issue? What do you guys think about that?
I think it's wrong. I just don't think it's a good argument at all.
Okay.
I think it's a terrible argument. I agree with everything that Clinton just said. You know, I can't say it any better almost. But to say this is a salvation issue, I mean, if you're a skilled musician and you're making a joyful noise to the Lord, you know, I don't see how that's wrong in any sense, and that's a salvation issue. You know, and I don't think it necessitates that as well. I don't think it. In other words, I would disagree with Zwingli on this one. That, you know, just because the New Testament didn't have it in there doesn't mean that, you know, they didn't practice it. So they took all the instruments out of the church. I don't agree with that. I think that was foolish. I think, it was just a bad move altogether, because music is one of those things that bring everybody to the table. It's one of those things that we all have in common as part of the human experience, like Josh said, you know, just like food, just like wine and, you know, other things, it brings people to the table, you know. So I totally disagree. It's an art form. God made us to be artists in some way, shape, or form, you know, whether your art is philosophy or whether your art is winemaking, or whether your art's culinary or it's musician, you know, or a painter or an architect or something. You know, God has given us that ability, and we're to use that, I think, in worship.
Could we maybe flip the argument, so to say, and it be logical? Dale, I know you and I were talking about, you know, logicians and different syllogisms and things like that, how to structure a sound argument, basically. And if one wants to say, well, the New Testament never explicitly commands the use of worship there, or the use of instruments, therefore we should not do it. Could I just flip that and say, well, the New Testament doesn't prohibit the use of instruments, therefore we should do that? Does the same reasoning kind of follow from both arguments? Are both applicable at this point, or are they both unsound? Go ahead.
Yeah, like you said, David kind of hinted at this, right? Like, so in the Protestants, that Zwingli took, I think it was, I might be mixing it up, you guys let me know, but there's the regulative principle of Scripture. So something, unless it specifically said you could do it, then it's wrong, you know, worship service. So because it doesn't say, you have to bring in this extra premise, this regulative principle, which is nowhere to be found in the Bible either. That's not in there. So they're kind of hypocrites, you could say, right? But then there's the normative principle, which says like everything is permissible unless it is prohibited in the Bible, right? Like saying that you shouldn't do it or it's your sin. And that's the principle that I take, the more of the normative way of doing worship service and stuff like that. Yeah. But yeah, again, both things can be logical. You can make a valid argument and stuff, but the question is, are the principles that you're using as a premise, are those biblically sound or not? And when it comes to the regulative principle, it's not sound. It's not in the Bible, and it's self-defeating. So yeah, it's not logical. Sorry.
Okay, thank you for that. Josh, what do you think?
Well, I mean, in general, I think the idea that because the Bible doesn't say that we should, or doesn't give a command to, and doesn't make explicit allowance for something, that we shouldn't do it, especially in relation to music. The Scripture also doesn't say that we should sing in time. It also doesn't say that we should use keys and that we should have harmonizing note patterns of overlapping patterns that are harmonious. It never mentions any of that. So I hope that they all sing terribly. Like there's literally nothing about music other than mentioning the voice and the descriptor that it's joyful and perhaps loud. That doesn't give you, like, we could all just kind of be hollering lyrics at each other, completely off time with one another, without the excellence of good instrumental playing or the timekeeping or any of those things. Like if we're like, it just, there's so many things that like this just doesn't have, there's no hook for me to hang that hat on.
And Josh, I just realized,
Mhm.
look, nothing is mentioned about StreamYard in the Bible. Oh my God, we're
Right.
sinning. We have to get off right now.
Right.
That's
There's
my
also
joke for
nothing
today.
about sunglasses. There's nothing about t-shirts.
Okay,
We should all be wearing sandals. Nikes are off the table now. Like there's so many things that it just doesn't make sense of reality to think that way.
Mhm. Mhm. I was thinking about this, and it was interesting because they kind of brought this up, and I'll link to their podcast. I'll link to the specific episode where Aaron, Chris, and or I'm sorry, Aaron, Scott, and Tucker are discussing this concept. But I'm just, I'm thinking while I'm listening to this episode, right? If we have something that is specifically mentioned in Scripture, okay, not distinguishing between Old Testament and New, but just all of what we consider Scripture to be Scripture, right? If this is explicitly mentioned in one testament that it pleases God, like these are instruments of praise. It never says that, like with the animal sacrifices, for example, that God is displeased with them offering songs of praise accompanied with instrumentation to Him. There's never, to my knowledge, that there is never that passage that specifically mentions that. If we're going to talk about specific passages, and so it seems like it would follow at that point, since God does not change, that the same things that he was pleased with in the Old Testament would carry on over into the New Testament. Now, here's where they would hit back. They would say, "Well, Tyler, animal sacrifices please God in the or in the Old Testament, excuse me, and yet we are prohibited specifically in the New Testament from offering animal sacrifices, specifically in Hebrews, right?" And so, what would you guys think about, if you were discussing this concept with Church of Christ member or any member that would say that instrument use is not sinful, is a salvation issue? What if they went that route? Well, we know this pleased God in the Old Testament, and yet it does not. We're commanded not to do this in the New Testament. Does that mean God changes? How would you guys deal with that if that was brought to you? Clinton, we'll start with you. Did we freeze up? Or
Well, I mean, no,
Oh.
when the Bible says God never changes, I think that just refers to his attributes. He has immutable attributes.
Sure.
Oh, sorry, I'm right. So yeah, sorry, my internet is not the greatest. Do you hear me?
Yeah. Yep. You sound good now.
Oh, can you hear me?
Delayed.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, sorry, my internet's kind of wonky. Okay, so yeah, so I would say that no, that's not an example of God changing, because I believe when Scripture refers to God being unchanging, it refers to his immutable attributes, things like his omniscience, his omnibenevolence, his omnipresence, things like that. That doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't change other things, such as his commands. There's a concept that theologians will talk about called progressive revelation, in which certain things that were required in the Old Testament are no longer required in the New, or certain things were revealed throughout time. For example, it's widely accepted that Abraham in the book of Genesis was a polytheist, but God had to reveal himself as the one true God to Abraham. That's one of the reasons why, for example, he commanded him to sacrifice his son Isaac, was because he was showing that he's not like those pagan gods that require a child sacrifice, but in fact, he doesn't require those kinds of things. He's different than the pagan gods of the surrounding cultures. So I don't think that means, God being unchanging means that God's commands can never change, or that his desires for us would never change, or those kinds of things, because there are certain things that do change with with the times. Obviously we live in houses now instead of huts, so there's certain things that are required of us, that were required of us before, that are no longer required of us, just because standards of cleanliness have improved, and things like that. So when it comes to certain things like using instruments in the church versus things like animal sacrifice or eating shellfish or things like that. Well, we have to keep in mind that there are different kinds of laws that were established in the Old Testament. The moral law, which is binding on all people for all times, ceremonial laws, and civil laws for the ancient Jews. So there's nothing immoral about using instruments in worship, so it's not part of the moral law. But ceremonial laws have ended, and some have changed, and of course the civil laws have changed because we're no longer under the civil law of the ancient Jews; we're under the civil law of the United States. So
Mhm.
so those kinds of things need to be considered too. So when we talk about if it's wrong, if it's prohibited now for us to use instruments in the church, well, there are no specific prohibitions against using instruments in the New Testament like there are for things like animal sacrifice, because Christ died on the cross, which means that now we can come to Christ directly rather than having to sacrifice animals to cleanse us in certain rituals. So we have prohibitions against that. When we take the 10 Commandments, we have prohibitions against 9 of the commandments. We're still forbidden from murdering, we're still forbidden from lying, those kinds of things. But there's no specific prohibition against working on the Sabbath any longer. Because we have certain New Testament passages now which tell us, well, first of all, we know that the Christian church no longer meets on the Sabbath being Saturday, because we meet on Sunday, because that's the day that Christ was crucified, and that's when the first century church met to break bread. So we know that that there's no specific prohibition against working on the Sabbath, because now Sunday is what we consider to be the Lord's day. And in fact, certain texts in I think Colossians and Philippians tell us, if one person regards all days the same, or one person sets one day apart from the Lord, either one is fine as long as what they're doing for the Lord. So we have
Right.
specific prohibitions against certain things in the New Testament, but we have no such prohibition against using instruments in the church. So we can say that God, being unchanging, since he's never given us any prohibition against using instruments in the church, I think it's safe to say that using instruments in the church are still allowed, and in fact are still pleasing to the Lord.
You brought up a good point, Clinton. There's no specific text that says worship on Sundays. There's no specific command giving. Now, we can infer that from the text. We see this in concepts where Paul specifically in Acts talks about how they broke bread together on the first day of the week. Revelation talks about this concept, right, of meeting on the first day of the week. And so I think the same would apply given the Jewish background, and we'll get into the New Testament now at this point. But given the Jewish background and what Paul says in texts like Ephesians 5:19, for example, Colossians 3:16, Acts 16:25, James 5:13, all these texts we'll read here in just a second. But given that they had this concept of setting music to psalms specifically, leads people in the Church of Christ, and you can hear this on the Bright and Ross debate, where Ephesians 5:19 is not talking about Old Testament Psalms primarily. Primarily, it's talking about different kind of New Testament Psalms. I don't know. There never was an example given. But not to say that it rejects these Old Testament Psalms, but it just includes them, and they're not, and the primary focus is not on them. I would beg to differ on that. Whenever Paul talks about in Ephesians 5, we'll start in 15, for example. I'm reading out of the ESV. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the times, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart, giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. Again, we see this concept in Acts 16:25. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the rest of the prisoners were listening to them. In Colossians 3:16, Paul says, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and exhorting one another with all wisdom, singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, all with the grace in your hearts to God. And the last one, James 5:13 says, is anyone among you suffering? He should pray. Is anyone in good spirits? He should sing praises. Now notice, guys, that any use of instrumentation was not specifically mentioned in these texts, but yet the command and an imperative to sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs was given in all of these texts that I just read. And so my line of thinking is, given that Psalms are specifically mentioned, premise one, right? That they used instrumentation in the Old Testament that these people, Jesus, the apostles, they were familiar with. I'm sure whenever they went to worship, they sung psalms. The same instrumentation was used, maybe not the same instruments, but the same instrumentation was used in singing these psalms to Christ. I would say because Paul references psalms specifically and not just hymns or spiritual songs, this would carry over to that. Of course, they're not going to use instruments in prison. Duh, right? But this, again, it just seems like it's clear to me that if you're incorporating psalms, if you're not going to deny that these are actually Old Testament psalms primarily to be sung to God in praise, then it just makes sense to me that the concept of instrumentation would carry over, so you don't have to make this a salvation issue. It can definitely be a liberty issue. For example, the Orthodox Church, we don't use instruments in our parish. We sing and chant a cappella, right? And I don't have a problem with that at all. But to make it a salvation issue and tell somebody your soul's in danger because you use instruments, I think is stepping over the line. What, Josh, David, Dale, what do you guys think?
I'll let them go ahead, because I'm gonna ask a question that I'm gonna try to back them up a little bit. So yeah, maybe I should wait and see what the others say, and then I'll ask like a follow up question kind of thing.
Okay. Go ahead, Josh.
Okay. We're all so courteous here. I love this. So
Are you pleased?
Okay. I am pleased already.
Are you going to make a joyful noise for us?
I am. I'm going to try. Hopefully, I sound jolly as a Roger, but that doesn't always come across. I think
that's debauchery, sir.
I think if somebody's going to talk about, okay, the Old Testament and the New Testament don't have perfect continuity because look at this one example that I can show you where something happened in the Old Testament where God says, nope, no more. Okay. That kind of specificity is really, really helpful for us in determining whether or not this is something that we should carry over in every avenue or only carry over in the explicit warning category, right? Where you could say the teaching of the Sabbath or something like that was not repeated in the New Testament as an explicit command. All of the other 10 commandments were, right? And so we can see in that there's some difference in that a little bit. Does that mean that we should just not have Sabbaths or whatever? No, I don't think so. I think that maybe it's useful if we can use some of the things in the Old Testament that were a blessing from God to his people, because the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That's something that should be seen as a blessing, right? And instead, what we often do is try to draw borders and framework around what you must do, almost like we're trying to create an inheritance of a new oral tradition that we can use for the day-to-day individual things that we do. If you don't, you have to do it this way. If you don't do it this way, then you're in danger of straying off the path or what have you. Tyler's remark on liberty, I think, is probably the best way of looking at it. Is ultimately music is, like I said, imperative. It's integrated into the human experience. You're not going to get away from it. It just is what it is. The idea that instruments, because they're not mentioned specifically in the passages that he was reading from, are therefore not allowed, I think is a leap that doesn't have a premise. Like I don't see anything undergirding that other than this kind of piety statement about how, I get it. God takes worship seriously. We can all agree with that. But that's not the question. The question wasn't, does God take worship seriously? Because even as Clinton said, the musicians that were there in the Old Testament were not, Joe down the street who bought a guitar in a summer, learned how to play a couple of chords, and then him and his buddies got together in their garage and started, toying around with a couple of sounds. It's like, no, what they were aiming at was a level of excellence that established that the worship was of the highest caliber, rather than, it's in this particular fashion or in that particular way, unless it was made explicit. And so I think the fact that the prohibition of animal sacrifice in the New Testament is explicit is an example of why that kind of explicit thing should be necessary, to show this is how we do and how we do not do it, right? To draw guardrails rather than a jail cell, because I think you can make these parameters so narrow that you cease to have the source of what should be the joyous noise is being replaced with a noise of obligation. And I don't think that that is what God was aiming at in giving us music and giving us that drive, but also in allowing us to integrate that into how we worship him. I think that in the modern church, when I say worship, the fact that everybody thinks of only the music portion of the event, I think that was a mistake for sure. But I don't think that maintaining instruments in that setting is a mistake. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in the worship group that I'm in at my church. I would think that that was a flaw. I would not participate in that way. But what I'm doing and what I have the privilege of doing every Sunday is acting like a conveyor belt. The same way that liturgical churches like the one Tyler, the parish that Tyler's attending, uses icons, and they believe that to be something like a window to heaven. The Protestant and the regular contemporary Christian kind of around the world right now would view it very much the same way, is that the worship is providing something like a window into heaven. I'm a conveyor belt to give you what God has for your experience in here rather than just in here. And then the pastor is addressing this and not just this. And so you get something of a balance in the way that we're looking at trying to approach these things of how is it that I'm going to, in some sense, access the divine from this menial room that we're all sitting in. It's like sometimes we just go too far at trying to draw boundaries around what we think that should look like in a way that I think is unhelpful when scripture hasn't gone so far as to be explicit.
Absolutely, Josh.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to go next.
I was just going to say to our audience real quick, David, and I'll get right back over to you. What do you all think about this concept? Should instruments or not be used? Should we use instruments in the church? Do you, our audience, do you in your worship, do you use instrumentation in your church? Do you have a cappella? We definitely want to hear from you. Post below in the comments. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I was gonna concur with Josh here and just be like, it sounds like just a legalism, it's just like that, and I don't even know how pure it is. Like, are you really trying to create boundaries? Or are you just trying to establish your control, and basically corrupt something that is good? That's what I think about when I think about people that say you can't use instrumentation, because I think, like Tyler put it, like if we're to sing psalms and instruments were used in psalms, and they always have been used in psalms and in other songs and this and that, we're trying to create a harmony of sound. And we have to take that in consideration. Your voice, when you're trying to sing well, you're doing it with the harmony of sound. You're trying to make a harmonious sound, right? So, and in a way, that's where Clinton was saying your voice is a instrument at that point, because you're trying to make a melody, a harmony of sound, and music's the same way. With the instruments, you're doing the same thing, and I think that it comes down to, okay, well, I don't see this in the Bible, so I'm going to make it a prison cell, like Josh was saying, to everybody else, and they're just going to push that. And I think it has to do with this weird narcissistic satisfaction of that idea of control that you have over other people. And I think that is very much also involved, because we do corrupt the things that are good. We're human beings, and I think that's a big part of it. And so I don't think it's a good argument to say that to sing a new song to the Lord, or sing a song to the Lord, or to quote the scriptures you were about, the Psalms and stuff, to think that like stopped musical instruments from being involved just is fallacious. It's fallacious to think that would just randomly change.
Mhm. You know, here in a little bit, we're going to look at what John Calvin said about instrumentation, what Adam Clark, a famous Methodist pastor, said about instrumentation. And also, I have at least one quote from Spurgeon. We might dive into some other things. And people might be surprised about what these gentlemen said whenever it comes to the use of instrumentation, whenever it comes to the church and worship. We'll put it on the screen. But Dale, I know you said that you had a question. Do you want to go into that now, or?
I do, yeah, because it's related to what. That's why I wanted them to go, and so like obviously I'm kind of on board with you guys, but this is why I want to try to mix things up and be a bit of a disruptor. So let me try to. Okay, perhaps we would all agree, even as Protestants, look, we do have a lot of liberty, and that there's no reason for excluding all instruments. Okay, let's pretend that is true. One could also argue, but there are perhaps some forms of music that shouldn't be practiced, that are inappropriate, that lead to sin. Let's number one, if that's the case, could these Church of Christ guys be trying to make the argument that, look, that instruments back in the New Testament church, those are okay, but the ones today are no, because they have a different effect on us that lead to sin. Or lead to lustful desires or something. Could they be making a nuanced argument like that by saying that, well, modern instruments today, there's different circumstances. I just wanted to get people's take on that.
Yeah. Clinton, you're our guest, so we'll start with you, and then we'll just go around Josh, David, and then I'll jump in too.
Okay. Sure. I mean, I would say, I don't find that very persuasive either, because a lot of modern instruments have analogs to. In fact, we actually have modern instruments that are very much similar to the instruments from the ancient Israelites had. So I just don't find that argument very persuasive, because number one, we have a lot of the same instruments that they did, and number two, a lot of the instruments we have that they didn't have are still very similar. We have acoustic guitars, for example, which are pretty similar to the ancient lyre, which is also a stringed instrument, which if I'm remembering correctly, I think was sort of like a small harp. It was a sort of instrument. Or I might be thinking of a different one, but they had instruments that were very similar to the instruments that we have today. Now we have harps which are a lot bigger, obviously. Oh, are you still there?
Yeah, no, I'm listening. I can hear you.
Okay, look like the screen froze again. Okay, so yes, because we have a lot of the same instruments, and we have a lot of instruments that are similar, even though they're different. And I just don't see that the instruments we have today are so dissimilar that they can produce emotions in people that they wouldn't have been able to produce back in the time of the ancient Israelites. We have music which today would be considered very sensual, but there was music written back in the Romantic period and the Renaissance period, which are also very sensual. You had a division between sacred music and secular music, and you had music then that could be very sensual as well. So it's not. So I just don't. I just don't see in the instruments we have today that they're so dissimilar to the instruments they use that they produce new and novel emotions in us that could lead to sinfulness, because it's the instruments back then could be used in such a way as to stir emotions. And really, music is great at stirring emotions. That's one of its key aspects, is it can help us feel certain ways, depending on how the music goes. If you play something soft and melodic, it can sound very beautiful, and it can even move you to tears if it's played well enough. Or you have music that can make you feel more aggressive. The music of Wagner is great at that kind of thing. So it just really depends not on the instrument itself, but on how you play it, that can really evoke these kinds of emotions. So I just don't find that a very persuasive argument.
Josh, what do you think?
I agree. I think that's probably a really good way of putting it. If there was any real innovation, let's say, I think the real innovation between instruments, let's say 2000 years ago versus right now, the only real difference is in articulation, let's say range, and the invention of the bass clef, perhaps. Outside of that, I can't see very much difference at all in the fact that, tones and microtones have always existed. Dissonance has always made us go "Ugh," or "Ugh," and it's like harmonious patterns that overlap are ancient. And it's like the idea that music should be isolated from everything else and be treated that way is just so odd to me. Especially as a percussionist. I play drums, which means I also play my lap. I also play the drums, the drums on my steering wheel. I play, I can snap my fingers, I can clap, I can literally, my body is an instrument because I'm a drummer. And so it's like, it would be like saying that, I'm failing for example, but basically you're putting a hedge around something that really doesn't neatly fit unless you're willing to try to like enumerate everything in the entire universe is like, that's unsuitable. That's unsuitable. That's unsuitable here. Like, cause you can't draw a firm line anywhere at that point. That's what I was saying earlier is that I don't think there is a line that you can draw someplace unless it was, let's say, the type of music for the setting could be inappropriate or disjointed or whatever. Let's say you were going to a dance, they started playing a dead march, like it wouldn't work. Like, it doesn't work. All the instruments could be in tune, everything could be right about the song, just the wrong song for the wrong setting, right? But does that mean that dead marches and funeral music shouldn't exist? No, I don't think that. I think that would be a silly thing to say, right? And so having the dissonance of the music played versus the setting is one thing. Saying that instruments or music itself is somehow either dirty or clean is very weird. I can say that lyrical content can have that kind of dichotomy, but I don't think that music can, especially as somebody who really loves instrumental music. Because of that ability to leave it unmapped and subjective, I can then identify it in a really private way. But because what we're doing at church has accompanying lyrical content, it doesn't have that ambiguity anymore. It is harnessed, right, and it's tied directly in. It's integrated in. You know what I mean? I just don't think that we can get outside of that and draw some firm lines somewhere and make sense of the thing. It just doesn't live anywhere.
Right. I agree. You guys both pretty much have, kicked this horse enough, but I would say, yeah, Dale, that's a ridiculous question on that, in that way, because, I don't think there is I agree with these guys. I mean, where do you draw the line? I mean, what are you trying to prove? I mean, what instrument are you against, at this point? And why is a lyre can be used versus a guitar? I mean, it's just, to me, the issue comes down to the worshiper, right? So if you're going to church to become a rock star by leading the praise and worship, then you're going for the wrong reasons, right? So if you're trying to sing a song that has nothing to do with praising God in church, then don't sing that song in church. There is certain music that goes with worship, and that's there's a demarcation there. There's a line that can be drawn on that front, but not on what musical instrument should be used.
I agree. So let me nuance it a little bit. In the same line as David was just talking about, right? There's a difference, I think, in questioning at this point, right? If you're going to church to be a rock star, your priorities are, I don't want to say, I can't think of the word, I'm losing track, but your priorities are messed up if you're going to church specifically to be a rock star, right? Now, you asked a more specific question, Dale, about instrumentation, right? Instruments fall in main categories, right? You have winds, you have strings, and you have percussions, right? And so depending on what you're using, I think it's a different question to ask how one uses it, right? So now here's where I want to nuance it a little bit. So no, I don't have anything, and I don't see a difference. And I think it might even be a little silly to say I'm fine with the lyre, just to use the example that David used. I'm fine with the lyre, but I have an issue with a guitar. Why? Right? I don't think there's a justification for that. But here's the thing. Are we emphasizing these instruments over worship, over lyrics, right? Do you have a 13-minute guitar solo in a hymn? Is that what's being done to emphasize, to put the guitarist on this pedestal, right? What are we doing with these instruments is how I want to nuance, right? So I think this can be crossing that line, right? So to change your question up just a little bit, right? Not necessarily what instrumentation is used, but how are we using this? I think can cross a line even into something that is or not disingenuous, but can be something that God is displeased with.
Yeah,
At that point.
Tyler, I think that's you brought that out even more, and that was kind of my point. You don't go to be a rock star. What is your motivation when you take the stage on worship? So it comes down to the worshiper, right? What's your motive? Are you going up there to be seen? You might not want to be a rock star, but you want to be seen by your local congregation,
right?
Then you're doing it for the wrong reasons,
right?
There should be a singular focus, and that is to lead people into a communal time of worship where they honor God with their lips, their hearts, and their emotions, and lead them in spirit and in truth to worship God, which I think is the chief end of man almost. That's the greatest thing to do. And that's the chief end of man is to worship God in the spirit and truth and be in His presence like that. On this earth. So I think that's important. Very important, and I think we see the fruit of that. We see those that have gone up there and they lead people in worship, and they get these big platforms, and next thing you know, they're atheists. They don't believe in God, and we're getting a lot of that recently. With a couple of members from Hillsong, some of the Christian rock guys. We've seen it. We've seen the fruit of that, and maybe they did it for the wrong reasons. Maybe their foundation wasn't sure. Maybe they didn't have an answer for the hope that lied within them, when they started doing it, so their motivation is key. It is very key when it comes to the worshiper. And it's something you have to be careful with, and you have to take a look inside yourself. Self-examination is one of the biggest things as a Christian we got to do.
Yeah, no, and just to finish my thought real quick. So, whenever I think, then this is just my personal opinion, you guys can comment on this if you want, and then I do want to get into some of these quotes from Spurgeon, Calvin, and Clark. But my thing is, whenever and going to the Orthodox Church has really, I guess, fine-tuned me to do this more now. But whenever I find myself in the most, I don't know the word, worshipful experience, whenever I feel most connected to God is what I'm trying to say in worship. Is whenever I'm listening, I'm processing, and I'm trying to live out the lyrics that are being said, right? That are being sung, that are being chanted even. I am just floored whenever I'm connecting with the lyrics that are being sung. Now, this is the point that I was going to make, Dale, is that if you are trying to accompany these lyrics, these theological just love songs, I think that if you have the right hymn can be described that way. It seems like they complement each other very, very nicely. But then again, if you're singing a song about the incarnation and throwing, so I don't know if you guys are familiar with Dream Theater. I'm sure Josh and Clinton are very much so. But these guys are known for having 20-minute albums, 20-minute songs. And the majority of it's instrumentation, right? They're very technical. They're very progressive in music genre. And I don't see a need for that in worship per se, because if you're trying to accompany the lyrics with music, I don't see a problem with that. But then if you're going to emphasize even the player or the instrument itself, and you're putting on a rock concert, right? I think that is maybe even displeasing to God in that sense, because again, we're supposed to be making this worship for him. God's the spectator, is the way that I've heard it used before in our worship. We're the participants in worship, and we are giving our glory to God at that point, right? And worshiping him, praising him. So he's the audience. If we're seeking to maybe be even on the extreme of seeker sensitive, trying to get people in the church by emphasizing music and instrumentation, lights, camera, we have concerts for that type of thing. And I think that should not be done in a worship setting, because the two are different. They're two different things. Worshiping God and feeling good, even trying to seek a I don't know why I'm having trouble gathering my thoughts, but I think there's a difference. I'll put it like that.
I'll just say, okay, thank you, guys. And I hope you guys realize I was just playing devil's advocate for the Church of Christ. But
Absolutely.
Tyler,
Sure you were, you Canadian.
And I actually do have
Canadian bacon.
No, I just want to compliment Tyler. Like, Josh, you've just been destroyed in terms of poetic eloquence, because God is the spectator. I'm going to remember that, because that impacted me in terms of the worship service. I've never thought of it like that before. So that was great. A great way of putting it. So yeah, thank you.
All right, guys. So let's do this.
I think Clinton was going to say something else.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Clinton.
Actually, if I could real quick, I actually do have something to say on the topic of soloing, whether it be guitar solos or keyboard solos or whatever. Is that I absolutely agree that a church service is not a place for soloing. But what a lot of people don't understand about bands like Dream Theater, or there are Christian analogs too. I listen to a lot of Neil Morris, and Neil Morris is a progressive songwriter. He considers himself a Christian. Unfortunately, he denies the Trinity, so that puts him sort of in the heretical camp. But he writes a lot of great music, and I know, and he actually plays a lot with the former drummer from Dream Theater. I'm blanking on the guy's name. It's not Petrucci. Petrucci was the guitar player, but
Portnoy?
I don't know. Maybe Josh would. Portnoy, that's the guy. Yeah,
yeah.
Plays with Mike Portnoy a lot, and he played. Yeah, and his keyboardist is actually in a Christian band called Apologetics, which I really enjoy. But Neil Morris does progressive music, and there are others. Theocracy is a metal band that has some progressive elements, and they wrote a 20-minute epic. But yeah, with bands like Dream Theater, the thing is that instrumental music can also be an offering to the Lord. And now bands like Dream Theater aren't worshiping God when they play, but they do have these long extended instrumental sections. Sometimes they solo, or sometimes they're just instrumental sections where the whole band is kind of complementing each other. The thing is that you can worship God through your playing, and that's because an instrument itself, if played correctly, can actually be quite musical. And so we often think of vocal music being offerings to the Lord, but a lot of instrumental music written by classical composers were written as offerings to the Lord. I've played a clarinet concerto by Mozart, and the middle movement was actually written for church performance, and it was written in 3/4 time, because 3 is representative of the Trinity. And so something like that can be something very nice to play for a special performance kind of thing, not the kind of thing you would play in the middle of leading congregational worship. So the reason that you have bands doing these big long drawn out instrumental sections is because instrumental sections can also be very compelling and can be very musical. And so an instrumentalist can absolutely play his instrument for the Lord. And if he were soloing, he can absolutely solo for the Lord. But the problem is when you're actually leading congregational worship, there is this issue that you don't want the focus to be on the player, you want the focus to be on God. So even though the individual might be worshiping God by soloing, it's basically a situation where the congregation is just kind of watching this one person worship God. And so that makes it more about the individual than it does about the worship of God. So yeah, absolutely, I'm certainly on the same page that soloing has no place in congregational worship. But I just kind of wanted to add that for listeners who may not fully appreciate why there are these bands that write these 20-minute epics, and that's the reason why. It's because instrumental music can be just as vocal as music where the singer is actually singing. And there are a lot of people who appreciate music like that and can get into a group like Dream Theater, and there are a lot of people who can't, and that's perfectly fine. That's not your cup of tea. It's perfectly fine. But that's just to kind of give a little more background on why certain people do appreciate bands that can write these 20-minute long epics. Just because we appreciate the instrumental portions as well as appreciating the singer singing the lyrics of the song.
You're one of those people, aren't you, Clinton?
Hey.
I am.
That appreciates those long. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. No,
hey, I
was going
to say one more thing, Tyler, too.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no problem.
There's a time and place for things too, and there's a time and place where they lead the congregation in worship. So we're not saying that at the end when there's that altar call and that guy's just soloing in the background, just playing an instrument, making this nice harmonious noise at the end of the service. We're not saying that's wrong either. I mean, sometimes that's a good thing to me, because I've gotten time where I sung a new song to God to that melody that was playing, so there's times and places for things in the service and stuff like that. So I'm very I enjoy the freedom and the liberty that God has given us in that and in the services that we have. So
I think there's also something to be said. Okay, go ahead.
Oh yeah, sorry. No, I just wanted to throw something in real quick. It's kind of a funny story. Is that I actually found myself. I don't know if you listen to a lot of like Eric Clapton, but when he was with Layla and the Dominoes, they did that song. Derek and the Dominoes. They did that song Layla, and at the end of Layla is like a 4-minute jam where it's just like being led by the piano, and you have the guitar soloing. And I was actually listening to that one day. I don't even remember when this was, but I actually found myself worshiping God just listening to that musical jam, because I had like my mind was elevated to think on holy things and to think on God. And the guys were like high when they originally recorded that. So I think that no matter what it is, God can use it for His glory. Even a couple of high rock and roll musicians, recording a jam session that was really out of place after a rock song. So, yeah.
Right on. Go ahead, Josh. Now I want to get into these quotes by Spurgeon and Calvin and those guys.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree with that. That is a funny story, but I think that's actually a really good example of why what I was talking about before, music being integrative and it's just part of the human experience, and it has a natural way of being something like a universal language. And so there's that. But also I think there's probably something to be said on the end of, there's no problem with instruments in the church, but we need to be aware of the motive of the musician and the perception of the audience, so-called, in front. And already that dichotomy between musician and audience is kind of rearing its head. I think perhaps there's something to be said on the end of the person who thinks instruments shouldn't be there, to say you're creating this, dissociation between the congregation and that elite talented few that sit on the stage or whatever. There's probably something to that we could articulate better. I don't really have much for that, but in terms of being a musician, being somebody who helps to lead the worship in the church that I currently attend, and having done that for probably like a decade now, there are days when I went to church in the morning feeling great, sitting down at the drum kit and having this natural fluidity and articulation, barely any practice, no warm-up, just played perfectly that day. And rarely does anybody come up to me afterward and be like, boy, your playing was exceptional today. But every single time I think I blew it and the day was like trash or whatever, there's usually somebody who comes to me afterward and is like, you know what, like, you guys blessed my heart today. I really, like, I noticed what you were doing. It stood out to me. That part, like, that was really cool. It get like, I got goosebumps, and then the chorus came back in. It's like they were so touched. They were so drawn to it because of the musicality. And it wasn't because that was the best drumming I had ever done. Usually it's awful, right? Like, those are the days where I'm seriously critiquing myself as a musician, being like, I don't know why that was so sloppy, so weird, because I'm aiming at excellence, right? And it's not necessarily like I'm aiming to be seen. I'll admit there are probably times when that's been the subcurrent of my attitude or whatever. But in general, I sit down at my drum throne. I'm very still. I don't like play excessively beforehand, make a bunch of noise during, whatever else. And as soon as the music is over and my pastor begins praying, I literally just kind of quietly exit the stage and go chill in the hallway. Yeah, I'm not interested in being a spectacle, right? But there's something that C.S. Lewis said about authoring that I think is applicable to music. The author shouldn't be making a spectacle of himself, but perhaps become a set of spectacles through which somebody else can see the world, right? And so looking at music as being something very much like that. I love storytelling. Music is very much the same, but music is something that we want to embody. It's why naturally in ancient cultures there was dances, and their they would use music in their ceremonies, and everything was surrounded by musicality, right? Music is something that can bring together multiple things into a unity, and a unity that everybody can participate in, and there's something enchanted and experiential about it, right? The scripture even says that the body itself, the body of Christ, many parts working in unison. That is literally what good music is. And so I think that in some sense, the way that we can look at music, especially the instrumental kind that's outside of the, Sunday church worship framework, there's something in there that I think actually embodies what it should look or feel like to have that proper koinonia, to have that fellowship and that unity together. Music can give us glimpses of those things. You know what I mean? And so I think that instruments and instrumentality for the musician is something that is you should be aiming at excellence, but it's right to check your motives. But it like I think that we often kind of think about it like, oh, then maybe I should just aim at mediocrity so nobody looks at me. Like, no. Aim at excellence. You know what I mean? So there's something to that. There really is.
Right on. All right, guys, let's transition now. So I want to throw up, it looks like I've got 3 quotes. I've got more, but apparently I did not upload them. I thought I did, but they are not here. But I'll read them. I think there's only one more that I got. But so these are quotes from Adam Clark, who is a Methodist, who was a Methodist pastor. He's long gone now, dead for a couple 100 years, I think. So Adam Clark. We've also got a quote from John Calvin. We also got a quote from Spurgeon. And I was floored whenever I first saw and heard these quotes. So the clips that are the pictures that you're going to see here in just a second on the screen. And I'm sorry for those listening on the podcast that's not watching this right now, but we will read, or I will read the quotes for you. But I was floored whenever I originally heard it, just because some of the language that's used, especially from Adam Clark, in this. And I hope I got the right one up here. But let's start. So what we'll do, we'll read the quote, and then we'll just go around the table. I will eliminate myself from this part of the discussion only by just reading the quote. But I want you guys to talk about this and see if you agree, disagree. If you do disagree, why? If you agree, why? And so the first quote that I have is from. So this is from Adam Clark. This is from his commentary on Amos 6:5. You can look this up for yourself. And this is what he says. So he says, quote, I farther believe that the use of such instruments of music in the Christian church is without the sanction and against the will of God, that they are subversive of the spirit of true devotion, and that they are sinful. If there was a woe to them who invented instruments of music, David under the law, is there no curse to them who invent them and introduce them into the worship of God in the Christian church. I am an old man and an old minister, and I here declare that I never knew them productive of God, and have had reason to believe that they were productive of much evil. Music as a science I esteem and admire, but instruments of music in the house of God I abominate and abhor. Whoever wants to jump in, agree, disagree? If so, why?
I think Clinton should go first again.
Yeah. I guess this delay has gotten a little bit longer. So what's happening? The reason you guys are hearing a little bit of silence is because there is a delay between our connection and Clinton's connection. But Clinton, whenever this catches up to you, go ahead and just start talking, brother.
Yeah, well, clearly I would disagree with that, but right off the top of my head, I can think of one good thing that instruments do. It helps people. Yeah, so right off the top of my head, I can think that one good thing that instruments do is they help people sing on key. I've been
No, we can hear you, but you're just delayed. So when you catch up,
okay.
you hear this.
All right,
Keep
yeah,
going.
yeah. Sorry about that. Again, like I said, my internet connection is really bad. I use HughesNet, and they're very, very slow. And they know they're slow because they lock you into a 2-year contract, whereas a lot of internet providers don't do that. But yeah, so I was just thinking that one thing I can definitely hear, or think definitely. Okay, so yeah, so one thing I can think of off the top of my head that musical instruments do, as far as benefiting the service is, not only do they provide, some extra musicianship and some extra, color and tones to the music that you're playing, but they also help the congregation to sing on key. I mean, I've been in a church uh, where you know where no music was being played, but the person, the cantor, if you will, was trying to lead the congregation in worship, and I couldn't sing with him because, me being a trained musician, I don't have perfect pitch, but I do know how to sing on key. uh, I couldn't sing along with him because he was not on key, because he didn't have any sort of instrument in his ear, like a piano or a guitar playing, where he could hear the pitch where he was supposed to start, where he was supposed to go. And so, I think, just right off the top of my head, that's one thing that I would say instruments add beneficially to the church service, is they help. Aside from adding tone colors and things to the music, it helps the congregation be able to sing on key and to know where they're supposed to start and where they're supposed to go as far as the notes they're supposed to sing.
I think that it would be funny. So we do the exact same thing in the Orthodox Church. So you have the director, or I forget the technical name for the one who leads the choir in chants and in hymns and singing the songs. But he will hum, or not going to do it because I, unlike Clinton, cannot sing in pitch, and so I don't have any formal training. So y'all ain't never going to see me do that, right? I'll sing in the shower, and that'll be good. But what he will do is either hum or let out, like an that's the closest you're going to get from me. So that's it. But he will so it's usually somebody that is exceptionally trained, or they have perfect pitch, what Clinton was talking about, and they will get the person that is supposed to be singing on key with their voice. And so I think that that's one maybe an alternative that you could have from instrumentation. If you don't use instrumentation in the church, you can still get on key by that, by doing that, or having the little, what's the, Josh, you might help me out on this one, but what's the little instrument? It's not like an instrument, but it's maybe a key finder or range finder or something like that, where you kind of blow
think you're
it.
talking about the little tuning whistle.
Yeah, the tuning whistle, where you're like, dude, or whatever, and then it gets somebody on key. That would be funny, I would think, to hear that right before a worship song or something. Josh, what are your thoughts on Adam Clark's commentary on Amos?
Well, what's funny actually is the parish that I did visit this year, when I took my wife to an Orthodox parish for our anniversary, they did use a tune whistle in order to maintain key, because they were going back and forth between differing keys depending on what it was that they were singing, and so they actually did use one of those. It was a very small, gentle looking elderly woman who was just, it was really cute. But anyway, the quote that you read from Clark, I feel like is a great anecdote for why he wouldn't do it in his church. But I see no reason for me to abide by it as a rule of thumb. I really don't. And he even made explicit, in my time, I've seen nothing, but this is what I have seen. And to that I say, okay, cool. I mean, I don't see that there's anything that I could say to persuade someone with such a strong opinion. And that's fine, other than to perhaps do the Orthodox thing and just say, come and see, I can play, something that I think would be touching or moving or whatever, and say, does this instrument not strike you? If not, fine. Maybe your ears are deficient. That's fine. I just don't think that it's a moral deficiency. I think maybe that's user error. But I don't think that there's necessarily anything that I would have, like, let's say, to offer as argumentation against it, other than that's cool. And you are welcome to that opinion. But I think that it would stop at being opinion.
It's very subjective, is it not? Even the quote is, dude, this is my opinion, but I'm not safe. Notice what's missing, right? It's not explicitly stated that Adam Clark says, and every other church, right? But David, what do you think? I wish we had Dane on here too because since he is Methodist, to get his opinion on Adam Clark, and because Dane plays drums as well, right?
Yeah.
To contemporary worship. But David, what do you think?
I don't know if it's just me, but you're cutting in and out too a little bit, Tyler. But okay. I also try to understand people in their time. Okay. I respect Adam Clark. He has great commentary. I mean, phenomenal commentary on the Bible and stuff like that. I think was really, really good. But I try to look at these guys in their time, and if musical instruments weren't relevant at that time, then by all means don't use them. If people, if your group, if your congregation, if your parish or whatever did not subscribe to musical instruments, and they had none, and they didn't think it was a good thing, then that's part of the body that is going to do something different. Like Josh said, there is a freedom issue here, and understanding Clark in his time, they didn't have a lot of musical instruments in churches. It just wasn't a thing. So I can understand where they would get that opinion from. So again, just like Josh said, okay, I understand that in your church, but it's not how it is. And you know what? Here, and I want to say something about relevance, right? The church needs to be relevant in its culture. Plain and simple. Jesus was relevant in his culture. Church needs to be relevant in its culture. And they have to, perform that relevance with an extreme reverence so they don't take it overboard.
Yeah, relevance doesn't have to mean reflection. We don't have to look like the world to be relevant in it. But when the church ceases to be relevant, we cease to be listened to.
Right. Dale, did you want to comment on the quote that was read?
Yeah, I think Josh and David have already kind of said what I was going to say. Like, music is made for man. Man is not made for music. So if I don't know the historical context of what was going on in the 1700s and why instrumentation wasn't used in the churches, apparently, but yeah, like I said, that's fine. If it has a detrimental effect, if it takes away from the worship because of some cultural external thing that's going on, worshiping God is the most important thing, right? So that's fine, but it's not a rule, as Josh was saying. I don't see any moral rule or moral impetus that is universally binding for all churches at all times. I would just want to ask David if he knows the history, because he kind of hinted in the quote, if I remember, that he's like, I've never seen any examples where it's beneficial. Had he actually gone to a few churches that did have instruments and there was like bad effects? Like, what were the historical detriments that he was witnessing at that time?
I don't know if there were any specifically in Clark's case. I just know it was a tradition that kind of just carried over, and I know that back in those days there was a lot of legalism, when it came to music, because when you see musical instruments, they're owned by people that had wealth. I mean, that's why you have the difference between a violin and a fiddle, right? You have one with the cheap metal strings, I think, and the other ones are with another type of string, right? I from what I remember, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but they were seen in the rich, the high society. They were seen in the secular world, where people would drink, be debaucherous, and so they kind of related it to that. So that's probably, and this is just from the top of my head and learning, my learning in history, and what I've learned studying history is that was a common stigma of the time versus now what it is today.
All right, cool. So yeah, Tyler was asking someone to read the next quote. Does anyone know what quote he was talking about, or?
I don't have it up. No. Oh, there it is. Okay. I guess I can read it.
Sure.
John Calvin's commentary of Psalm 33, verse 2. But when they frequent their sacred assemblies, musical instruments in celebrating the praises of God would be no more suitable than the burning of incense, the lighting up of lamps, and the restoration of the other shadows of the law. The papists, therefore, have foolishly borrowed this, as well as many other things, from the Jews. Men who are fond of outward pomp may delight in that noise, but the simplicity which God recommends to us by the apostle is far more pleasing to him. That's from founder of Presbyterianism, John Calvin. There you go.
So, as the the executive producer, no, I'm just joking. I'm going to let Clinton answer that one first.
Just wait for the delay.
Actually, I'm experiencing some really bad lag as well, so I think I'm going to leave and come right back. So
Okay.
yeah, because I'm still hearing Josh reading the quote. So so just sit tight. I'm gonna leave and come right back. See if I can kind of reset the modem and see if that'll help kind of speed things up here.
Okay.
Right on. So Josh, why don't you take a stab at that one?
Oh boy. I think that this goes along the lines of the same thing that we were discussing earlier about animal sacrifice being eliminated from the Old Testament in the New Testament, and how that's explicit exclusion. That's something that was removed. Tyler, center stage. You better watch your motives, bro. Yeah.
Sorry, we're playing
musical
chairs while we're waiting for Clinton. Hey guys,
there he is.
it's me.
Beautiful. But
The
I
legend right
think
here.
that quote falls along almost the exact same lines of what we were talking about earlier, of the exclusion of animal sacrifice in the New Testament, the removal of certain portions of what we would say is the necessary fulfillment of the law. Christ did these things; he accomplished them with finality on our behalf. Therefore, nothing we do is going to add to or benefit that. This is done away with and replaced with something better, something higher. The fulfillment is greater, right? And so I think that's one of those times where that was not only necessary but made explicit. You're no longer doing this, you know. And so and to be honest with you, it's kind of odd that, you know, some of the things that were included in there, and then he would call them like incense and so forth. It's like I don't think I think that his attempt to associate certain things with Rome and therefore with error was just pushed a little bit too far in that quote. That's what I would say. I think that he was
Yeah, I would
probably
say
aiming at low hanging fruit.
right, and I would say that's the product of his time, right? That was what were they trying to? They're trying to distance themselves from Catholicism because they didn't want to fall back into what they thought what led to the abuses that
Mhm.
Catholicism brought forth. You know, so
I-
that
And we can make
again,
clear there were abuses. No
there
doubt.
were
Like there were
absolutely,
abuses going on at that time,
and,
and especially because like
and they did it too. And let's not, yeah,
exactly.
they did
I
it
was going to
too.
say it's
So
not like this is all one-sided. Like a lot of abuses happen because we're human, to be honest with you. Like,
well, yeah,
let's be real. But
right.
also, you have to remember that in this time period, like you said, the relevance of the time and context of the person and the quote, the renaissance of art and music and literature was like steaming. You know what I mean?
Yep.
The Enlightenment was well on its way, and the world was in a state of change and oddity and new stuff constantly. We've kind of amped that up like 1,000 times to where we are in the modern world,
Right.
to where, you know, before my life, but like the beginning of my life was also roughly the beginning of the internet, which is just a weird thing to think about. Life has changed so drastically, so
Well, there's
quickly for us that
Right.
we often don't recognize that drastic change was something that was very, very affective to people, in that it changed their perception, it changed their way of thinking. Those things, they weren't changing the way they thought every year like we are. That was a big deal to change the way you thought, you know. And so it just kind of rolling with the punches. I think what he was doing was taking something that he saw as an error and then being kind of, let's say, excessive to the opposite, like pendulum thinking. This way's wrong, therefore this way.
Right. And you know, you
one
can see this throughout history in the early church too, where Ignatius talks about you know, getting away from the practices of the Jews, you know, and being kind of cut off from them and doing their own thing. So it's very interesting to see how it kind of replays itself. But I think that's the context of it, and I think it would behoove us to understand the context of it before we
Well, there
you know, go
was
on and judge them anyway.
there was one thing that caught my eye that I wanted to, and it's something I maybe we haven't talked about, but obviously in his historical context, he's basically the things he lists, right? He wants religion away from these popish bells and smells and all these excesses. For him, simplicity, that's elegance. That if you want a pure worship, you have to get back to the simple way that they practiced it in the first century. That's kind of the Protestant thing. So that principle of simplicity, maybe are people being distracted? Hey, we've got a flute playing over here, we've got guitars over here. No, just shut up and let me sing a pure song to God. Maybe that's a principle that John Calvin has in mind there.
And that's not far off. I think that's probably true. And there's actually there's some echo of that even in the contemporary Christian scene over the last 2 decades. Is, you know, I sing a simple song of love to my Jesus, to my Savior, right? Like I remember singing that song for the first time. I was like, that's absolutely brilliant. So beautiful. What a stripped down, simple song. There's a difference between simplicity and reductionism. And I think that reductionism is more so what he was aiming at rather than simply simplicity in the way that you're describing it, as something beautiful to break the expectation and come back down to like, here, look, here's the bare bones of it.
Do you think? So I take your point about the difference between simplicity and reductionism, but just that in John Calvin's mind, what we're calling reduction is, do you think he thinks he's thinking of this elegant simplicity, or is he literally thinking of reductionism?
I really don't know how to psychologize John Calvin, so I probably would be amiss to be like, he's definitely thinking this. But I think that the motive that he has to, like I said, it's like pendulum thinking. This error, definitely error, therefore opposite extreme. I think that that's something that is very common to a lot of the Protestant movement, is stripping away these things, what we see as excesses, right? Even though, let's say, they didn't begin as an excess. They began as something that they thought was going to be this enhancement or accompaniment, a supplementation of something that could really help us into that window of heaven experience, right? But we see them now as excess because we saw where it could go. And instead of saying, yeah, that's probably too far, we said, that's probably evil, throw it out.
Right on, right on. I'm assuming, just taking the context of y'all's conversation, y'all read the John Calvin quote. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. I don't know if you guys have been kind of paying attention to my camera or not. Am I still lagging, or is that a little bit better?
It's not right now. Yeah, not right now.
But
okay.
Clinton just sent a message saying he's not. It's choppy. He's not going to be able to do much more. He's saying.
Yeah, I've got to run in about 15 minutes. Well, about 10 now. But let's do. Well, I don't know. What do you guys want to do? You guys want to end it now?
You know what? I think we said what we need to say.
I think we're almost at the 2-hour mark, and this has been really copacetic so far. I think this is great.
Clinton, is there anything that you want to add just to the conversation in summary before you take off?
Want to go over some announcements right now, Tyler?
Well, I do, but at the same time, I don't want him to hear me start talking and then quit, you know.
Right.
I wanted to say a joke, but again, I didn't because.
Right.
Well, you don't make jokes because you're Canadian. So.
Well, nothing that I can really think of. I think, I think this discussion was good. Again, I apologize about my internet issues. Hopefully next time I do a podcast, I'll be able to have a better internet connection. But I think we've had a good discussion. I pretty much said all that I can contribute to the conversation. So yes, I do appreciate you having me on to have this discussion, because it is important. Like we said earlier, I don't think it's a salvation issue about whether we disagree or use instruments in the church or that kind of thing, but it's definitely a very important discussion, especially if you want to to have a worship service that is pleasing to God. Then we want to make sure that we're doing things correctly. And, obviously we all seem to be of the same mind here, that musical instruments are appropriate for worship services. So I think
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. We appreciate it, Clinton. So as for announcements go, what we'll do is I do want to encourage everyone. So I have now added a Cash App and a Venmo account to the Faith Unaltered ministry. I was going to say franchise, but we're not too big to be called franchise yet. But if you would like to donate and financially support our ministry, there is a link in the description. You can donate either by Cash App or by Venmo. I plan on adding some more later on for those who don't have those services. But it's free if you want to, download Cash App or Venmo real quick. I know Josh uses Venmo. We've sent money back and forth over Venmo before. It's super safe, super efficient, I think. But if you would like to donate to our to our ministry, please, in the description, there's 2 links, Cash App, Venmo. You can do that. Also, we have a good discussion planned for tomorrow at 2 p.m. with Dale. We're going to have our friend from Sweden. I'm not going to pronounce his name right now. I'm going to ask him how he pronounces his name before I even try to do that. He's Orthodox Christian. He runs the YouTube channel and podcast called About John. So if y'all want to check that out, feel free to do that. We're also going to try to get Dane Von Ace back on for that discussion as well. And we're also going to have Andrew Elliott, so my good friend from TikTok, to come on. We did a episode about reviewing his debate with Jacob Seiler on the Trinity. So specifically about, is Jesus the Father? Jacob is a Oneness Pentecostal who's commented actually on a couple of our episodes. And so we've seen him in the chat, and we're going to be discussing things like the monarchy of the Father tomorrow. If we get into it, we're going to prove Dell wrong on his 6th council denial, and we'll see how that goes.
I've got 3 more councils on the Trinity that you guys are in for a world of hurt. Sorry.
Oh, snap. All right. Well, it's going to be a good discussion tomorrow. I think that's at 2 p.m. Eastern time. We'll probably start, a couple of minutes later than that. Make sure everybody's here, run some sound checks and all that fun stuff. But we plan to go live before 2:10 p.m. tomorrow. Other than that, guys, we've got a debate next week between Father Jonathan Ivanov as well as our friend Pastor Samuel Farag again. So part 2 with those guys. They're going to be debating the Orthodox view of Mary. Is Mary co-redemptrix? Does Mary offer anything in regards to salvation as in co-redeemer? And so I know that the focus is going to settle on that concept. I've got a couple questions lined out for him, and then we're going to take a couple hymns from the Orthodox liturgy that specifically mentions Mary. Dale brought a couple of them up in his solo video that he did about why he was Protestant. We're going to be discussing those things. And so that's going to be a really fun discussion. Then the following week, we'll have Isaiah Burridge on to discuss faith in the times of suffering. And then after that, again, Dane is coming back on to discuss biblical archaeology. And let me actually get my calendar pulled up real quick. I know we've got one more planned. Yeah, on the 30th. We've actually got 2 shows that day. So one at 1 p.m. That's going to be a debate between David Russell, our own David Russell, and Louis Dazan over the intercession of the saints. David is obviously Protestant. So is prayer to saints, or is asking saints to intercede for us, biblical concept? Does God approve of this type of worship? However they want to word it. I don't know the exact thesis. Maybe Dale or David, you guys can elaborate on that a little bit. But they will be discussing the concept of intercession of the saints in debate format. Then again at 7 p.m., we will have Nicholas Soliner on to discuss the paranormal from a Catholic perspective. So Nick, and I don't want to misrepresent him, but I think Nick believes that we don't go straight to heaven. So if we're saints, we're saved. We don't go straight to heaven after we die. And this includes people that end up going to heaven that maybe would skip over purgatory. I'll let him elaborate a little bit more on that. But we got into a discussion one night that he saw a spirit, physically, tangibly saw a spirit. And I asked him, I said, well, do you believe that, that was a demon? We hear a lot of things like that, like ghosts or demons or whatever, or maybe some like residue energy. And he said, no. He said, I actually believe that's the spirit of someone who's not in purgatory, nor in heaven, nor in Hades. And so I was like blown away. We got to do an episode about that. So that's going to be what we're going to be talking about over the month of June. And then July, David and Dale and Josh are going to be taking the reins. I'm going on vacation for a month from Faith Unaltered. I need a break. So be praying for me during that time. And then I will be back in August. But David, Dale, do you guys want to elaborate a little bit more about your debate with Lewis?
Yeah, I see David's talking. He's muted.
Yeah, he said it all. I think you said it all. That we're gonna be discussing intercession of the saints. So it's going to be our invocation of the saints, whatever you want to call it, and we're going to go off that. So,
is there an actual thesis where you'll be taking the negative or the affirmative, like, or is it just going to kind of be topical on the subject?
go ahead, Dale.
The way I have the plan, this is a formal debate. I think we need to mix it up every now and then and do that. So yeah, you're gonna have your opening speech. He's gonna have his opening speech, making his argument, his thesis. Same with you.
So basically, he's for intercession. I'm against. So he will be presenting his case first.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Right on, guys. Right on. Well, David, Dale, Josh, you guys got any announcements?
Oh, that's it, brother.
Just that on CSG pretty soon I'm going to try to line up a couple of episodes about one's going to be about discussing AI, another's going to be discussing perhaps gender identity and sexuality in relation to the image of God, and then and that's, by the way, that's going to probably be different than what you're envisioning when I say that.
I was just going to say so Josh will be canceled next week. So
right,
Yep.
exactly.
CSG will be taken off the air.
He will not be back.
But yeah, and then the other thing that I wanted to do was try to continue on with more content in relation to narrative and symbolic patterns, like we did for our opening day for Faith Unaltered, when Garrett, Joshua, and I came on and talked about narrative patterns in Exodus. I'd like to continue that wholeheartedly. So those are going to be things that I have in the works for CSG in the future.
Nice. Dale, what we got on Real Seekers coming up?
Yeah, so believe it or not, I've been trying to take a break as well, but I don't, in terms of my Real Seekers thing. So I just basically am doing what you guys have got for Faith Unaltered. Obviously, I'm working with David to bring on some shows in July when you're on vacation. So we have a debate between me and Jordan on Jordan the Atheist from Reason to Doubt. In principle, at least, right? We haven't set the details up, but we're going to be debating miracles and the prior probability of miracles. How do we identify miracles in general, stuff like that. On my end, I am doing summary shows for my panel review series on the Shroud of Turin. So obviously I finished off the historicity of the Shroud, bringing on the experts for all these months. Now I'm going to be doing my solo show, my summary. What's my final conclusion after having listened to the experts, and I assign my probabilities to it and stuff like that. So those are the only things I'm doing for Real Seekers. Literally after that, it's just I'm doing the shows with you guys, and I'm going to be working on writings and researching stuff for the next few months and stuff.
And what's really cool is in the first 2 weeks of July, we have what I call the 2 weeks of Worth, right? So we're going to have Travis Worth on for 2 weeks. He's going to be discussing 1 week with Ben Watkins and the second week with Atheist Richard. So, I mean, that's going to be some fun shows right there. So stay tuned. Take us away, Tyler.
Richard is awesome.
He is. I love Richard. Richard Settles, the Faithiest Atheist. But all right, guys, thank you again for tuning in. Again, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you're listening, if you will, listen to this on the podcast, I'll edit out all of the long dead air that we heard tonight. Technicalities happen, y'all. It's just one of the things that kind of go with the game. So a big thank you to Clinton Wilcox for joining us. And we will see you next time. Absolutely, brother. Are we caught up now, Clinton? Is there a delay anymore?
I think we're caught up. I'm still hearing someone who was talking earlier still talking. So this is really weird. I've actually hosted podcasts in this room. So I have no idea why it's getting so bad. It's never been this bad whenever I've hosted a podcast. So,
we're making the devil mad.
But I do appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, before I take us out, since we're caught up now, is there anything do you want to plug? Where can people find you if they want more of you?
Oh, well, I mean, I do. I've done pro-life work for a while. So ordinarily I used to plug that, but I haven't really done a podcast or anything like that. So really, you can find me on Facebook. You could friend me there. Other than that, I don't really have any sort of like online ministry or anything that I could plug. So, so I would just say if someone wants to, wants to hear more, they could always just find me on Facebook. I'm always happy to have these discussions, especially discussions about music, which is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So.
Absolutely. Well, we thank you for coming on, brother. And until next time, to our audience, good night, God bless, and stay like Christ.